Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us here at Anderson House, and may I wish you a warm welcome. My name is Paul Newman. I am the Museum Collections and Operations Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence, fulfilling the aim of Continental Army officers who founded the Society of the Cincinnati in 1783 to perpetuate the memory of that vast event. In addition to today's Lunch Bite presentation, the Institute fulfills that aim by supporting advanced study, developing exhibitions and other historical programs and tours, advocating historical preservation, and providing resources to classrooms nationwide that benefit teachers, students, and scholars alike. Since 1938, the Society of the Cincinnati has done all this work from its headquarters right here at Anderson House, a National Historic Landmark that was completed in 1905 as the winter residence of Lars and Isabel Anderson. Today's Lunch Bite features the Institute's Historical Programs Manager Andrew Outten, discussing Charles Stedman's history of the origin, progress, and termination of the American War that contains detailed annotations made by British General Sir Henry Clinton. Prior to joining our staff in October 2021, Andrew spent 9 years as the Director of Education and Museum Services for the Brandywine Battlefield Park Associates. He has a particular interest in the military history of the Revolutionary War and a passion for creating and sharing programs to engage audiences in the importance of the American Revolution. Now, before I hand the lectern over to Andrew, as always, there are a few housekeeping items for those of you joining us on Zoom. Following today's Lunch Bite, there will be a question and answer session. Please feel free to submit any questions for Andrew using the Q&A function that can be found at the bottom of your screen. And we will do our best to incorporate them with our live audience questions. Should you have any technical related issues or comments, those can be submitted using the chat function, as one of our staff members will be monitoring that and will do their best to assist you. Now, please join me in welcoming Andrew Outten.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for everybody coming out today. For those of you tuning in with us at home, I do have a tendency to go way over my time, so I'm not going to spend too much time before we get into it. But again, thank you for coming out. So the topic today is basically a set of contemporary histories on the American Revolution written by Charles Stedman, volumes 1 and volumes 2. And we are going to focus on the annotations within these two volumes that relate to Sir Henry Clinton. So unfortunately, to start things off for you, unfortunately, very little information is known about Charles Stedman. What is known is that he was born in Philadelphia in 1753. He studied law at the College of William and Mary in Virginia. At the outbreak of the war, he remained loyal to the crown and joined the British Army, serving as a commissary under General Sir William Howe until Howe's resignation in 1778. Following this post, he commanded a provincial unit in the war's Southern Theater under Captain Francis Lord Rawdon. He was wounded twice, and he was also taken prisoner twice, but each time he managed to escape. Following the British surrender, he joined other loyalists and fled to England, where he received half pay as a colonel and was instrumental in settling claims for his fellow loyalists. Through the good graces of General Charles Cornwallis, Stedman was later appointed as Deputy Controller and Accountant General of the Revenue of Stamps in 1797, and he remained in England until his death in 1812. Although Stedman seemingly had an illustrious career while serving in the British Army during the American Revolution, his notoriety relating to the war really stems from his work, The History of the Origin, Progress, and Termination of the American War, that was published in 1794. Comprised of 2 volumes and written primarily from the British perspective, Stedman's work is one of the earliest comprehensive histories of the Revolutionary War that has been touted as the standard for future histories of the conflict. Stedman's 2-volume history begins with an introduction containing an overview of pre-war events, beginning with the commencement of the 7 Years' War in 1763, and ends with the formation of the First Continental Congress in 1774. This is followed by the main contents, beginning with the first chapter that begins with what Stedman called the insurrection in Rhode Island and New Hampshire in 1774 and the outbreak of war in 1775. From there, Stedman gives a detailed account of the war throughout approximately 800 pages within the 2 volumes before concluding with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, along with his own personal reflections on the war in the 2nd volume. Also included within both volumes are several battle maps that were specifically produced for this publication by the well-known British cartographer William Faden. Stedman's history shows that he was fully aware of the significance of the war and its global impact, as his detailed summary of the events throughout the 2 volumes not only include events that transpired in North America, but also the events that occurred in other regions of the British Empire, such as the Caribbean and Gibraltar. According to Stedman's assessment of the war, it was the grandest effect of combination that has yet to be exhibited to the world. Before the publication of Stedman's history in 1794, there were 9 other histories written about the American Revolution. Although Stedman's was the 10th, it was again the first comprehensive history that offered a full account of the war. And as with any credible secondary source or work in history, it is important to consider the sources that were used to produce it. In 1958, historian R. Kent Neumeyer wrote an article that was published by the Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Historical Association. Neumeyer dove headfirst into trying to sniff out Stedman's sources, which he claimed were primarily made up of 2 publications, the Annual Register and another history that was written by a fellow British officer. The Annual Register is a reference book that is written and published each year. First published in 1758 by Edmund Burke, the Annual Register still serves as an archival tool containing various records that pertain to the major events that happen throughout each year. For his first volume, Neumeyer claimed, aside from a few words, that Stedman copied the information and records contained within the various editions of the Annual Register that spanned and related to the American Revolution. For his second volume, however, Neumeyer implied that this was not the case, as only a small portion of Stedman's information was taken from various editions of the Annual Register. Instead, Neumeyer found that Stedman's second volume was more so heavily involved by British Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton's work in a history of the campaigns of 1780 and 1781 in the southern provinces of North America. As Stedman served in the war, the theaters of operations in which he participated came directly and accurately from him, albeit they can be considered as somewhat biased. But with that, Neumeyer concluded that Stedman relied heavily on the Annual Register, various editions of the Annual Register, and Tarleton's history to fill his gaps, which also reflect a word-for-word comparison. Now, Neumeyer also indicated that the 9 preceding histories that I mentioned before were also heavily reliant on the various editions of the Annual Register. So needless to say, Stedman's comprehensive history of the war is truly significant. We're very fortunate to have our own copy of this 2-volume set in our library collections. Not only is it significant, missed a slide there, as it is the original first edition, a copy of the original first edition, but it is also extraordinary in that it also contained it's also a copy that was once owned and meticulously annotated by British General Sir Henry Clinton, as was mentioned before. Who purchased this from Stedman for approximately 2 guineas. And we do have the receipt for you on display today. Clinton's annotations can be found and examined within the margins of no less than 80 pages within the first volume. His annotations consist of comments, personal defenses, and arrogant jabs pertaining to several events of the war, such as Bunker Hill, the failed British siege of Charleston in 1776, Burgoyne's ill-fated 1777 expedition in New York, along with other minor occurrences that involved Clinton. Through these annotations, we not only have the ability to see the war through the eyes of a major player, but they also help us to better understand Clinton himself, who many historians have placed a tremendous amount of blame on for losing the American colonies. Throughout the last nearly 2.5 centuries, historians have debated over Clinton's conduct throughout the American Revolution. While some have offered him some sympathy, most have vilified him. Common adjectives used to describe Clinton include sullen, embittered, jealous, frantic, unpopular, friendless, introverted, quarrelsome, erratic, capricious, hypersensitive, hypercautious, censuring, peevish, short-tempered, overly defensive, self-contradicting, quick to blame others for every minor setback or criticism that was directed towards him, and one who always seemed to complain about both being given too much leeway or too much oversight from his superiors. Clinton was born in North America in 1730. His father, George Clinton, was an admiral in the Royal Navy, but also served as the colonial governor of New York for a decade spanning from 1743 to 1753. Through his father's connections, Clinton secured a commission as a captain in the prestigious Coldstream Guards. By 1758, he obtained the rank of lieutenant colonel and was deployed to Germany, where he served during the 7 Years' War. Throughout his service in Germany, he experienced several major battles and also served as an aide-de-camp to Charles William Ferdinand, also known as the Duke of Brunswick, who was the hereditary Prince of Brunswick, which was a German principality. His service in Germany throughout the 7 Years' War was both a blessing and a curse. The blessing was that his experience under the Duke of Brunswick helped to groom and further develop Clinton's understanding of military strategy that marked him as a capable and experienced officer by the American Revolution. The curse was that this experience exposed Clinton to the German military thinking, a school of thought that tended to cause its students to look down on those who weren't exposed to the same system. This mentality of superiority would eventually cause animosity between Clinton and the other British officers during his later service throughout the American Revolution. Finally, in 1772, Clinton was promoted to Major General, and he left for America 3 years later. Following the outset of hostilities, Clinton was dispatched to Boston in 1775 with Major Generals William Howe and John Burgoyne to reinforce General Thomas Gage. As the trio had different professional backgrounds up until that point, they each had conflicting opinions on how the war in America should be conducted. These differences immediately laid the foundation for fractured relationships between them all that soon began to fester. Their conflicting approaches first clashed in Boston, where Clinton disagreed with the other British general's favored plan for a frontal attack at Bunker Hill. Clinton also suggested that the army be ordered to fortify the highest points surrounding the city before General George Washington could. Clinton's suggestions were dismissed, and we all know what transpired after that when General Washington did manage to occupy those heights, only to drive the British out of Boston a few months later. When General Howe assumed command of the British forces in North America from Gage, Clinton was appointed as his second. Soon after, Clinton experienced his first disaster with the failed siege of Charleston in 1776, a defeat where he attempted to deflect blame towards the Royal Navy for. Clinton returned to New York and redeemed himself when Howe implemented Clinton's plan at the Battle of Long Island, a victory that allowed Howe to secure New York. When Howe ordered Cornwallis to pursue Washington in New Jersey in late 1776, Clinton was ordered to devise a plan to capture Newport, Rhode Island. Clinton insisted that he be allowed, instead of this, to support Cornwallis in New Jersey, believing that the two could surround Washington's forces, but much to Clinton's frustrations, Howe rejected this plan as well. Had Howe agreed, Washington's series of victories at Trenton and Princeton may have been avoidable. Clinton was granted leave to return to England in January 1777, where he argued for command of the British forces in Canada. Unfortunately, again for Clinton, Burgoyne was favored by King George III and the British Secretary of State for North America, Lord George Germain. But being snubbed of that command, Clinton attempted to submit his resignation, the first of a series of resignations that he would submit throughout the war. But the king rejected his attempt and instead appeased Clinton by awarding him with a knighthood for his role in capturing New York. A disgruntled Clinton returned to America in July of 1777 and learned of Howe's plan for the 1777 campaigning season. Yet another plan that Clinton detested. Not only did he adamantly disagree with Howe's plans to capture Philadelphia instead of reinforcing John Burgoyne in the Hudson Valley, but he also felt degraded by Howe's orders for him to remain in New York and act as a reserve force for Burgoyne should he need any assistance. As Howe gallivanted in Pennsylvania, Burgoyne was left essentially hung out to dry. Clinton attempted to aid Burgoyne with the little force that Howe had left him by launching a series of distractive measures to attack and capture several American strongholds in the Hudson Highlands, but his efforts were futile. Burgoyne surrendered his army at Saratoga on October 17, 1777. Marked as the culprit, Howe submitted his formal resignation and shortly after returned to England on May 24th, 1778, That same day, Clinton assumed overall command of the British forces as commander-in-chief. Clinton's acceptance of his new command was saturated in pessimism from the start. Realizing that an ultimate British defeat was inevitable, and those are his words, his pessimism brought on intense paranoia of eventually becoming the commander that would be blamed for Britain losing her American colonies. My fate is hard, Clinton wrote upon assuming command, and indeed it was. His command was cursed from the start. Clinton had inherited a problem that neither General Gage nor Howe had to deal with: the French. Following the Franco-American alliance on February 6, 1778, England's colonial civil war was suddenly propelled onto the world stage. Clinton not only had to command the British forces with a French threat looming in the shadows, but he also had to do it with significantly less manpower against a rejuvenated American army that had been transformed at Valley Forge that winter. Upon being given overall command, Clinton also received new orders from Lord Germain. Instead of receiving reinforcements that he initially had been promised, he was required to detach a large portion of his overall forces so the Crown could reinforce other locations that it saw as higher priorities, such as the Caribbean and Canada. Clinton was left with nearly 20,000 less soldiers than his predecessors had at their disposal. With this, Clinton's paranoia and pessimism exploded. In addition to his forced detachment of valuable troops and resources, Clinton was also ordered by Germain to remain in New York and use it as his base of operations to conduct raids on American ports along the coast until further orders came through. Clinton was soon after informed of Germain's new Southern strategy that called for the conquering of Georgia and the Carolinas. Not only were those the most prosperous colonies in America for Great Britain, but they were also believed to have a large population of loyalists. Germain and the others in England, other officials in England, attempted to weaponize loyalist sentiments throughout the war. And this, again, was another strategy that contradicts Clinton's military ideologies. To Clinton, the greatest possibility of subduing the rebellion was by a show of force in the north through British control of the Hudson Valley and the Highlands. Going against what he believed to be his better judgment, Clinton unwillingly implemented Germain's Southern strategy. Following the British capture of Charleston, which he personally led, Clinton's pessimism turned to optimism, albeit for a short time. Still adamantly holding to his thoughts about the real threat and objective in the North, Clinton returned to New York and left his Southern army under the command of General Charles Cornwallis, another officer who Clinton had a fractured relationship with. Throughout the latter years of the war, Clinton and Cornwallis's relationship became increasingly volatile as the two proved to be virtually incompatible. Their inability to effectively coordinate with one another had a direct influence on the British surrender at Yorktown, Virginia, and has provoked two main interpretations from historians. To some, Cornwallis didn't receive sufficient or accurate guidance or information from his cautious and indecisive commander. To others, Clinton's subordinate was trying to undermine the commander-in-chief by taking matters into his own hands, a claim that can be argued through Cornwallis's direct correspondence with Lord George Germain. The reality that both officers were to blame, and this ultimately came down to conflicting interpretations or orders and correspondence, or the lack thereof, between them. Throughout 1780 to 81, the two were on entirely different paths that gradually veered further apart. Following his repeated struggles, Cornwallis thought the best way to finally subdue South Carolina was to conquer North Carolina and Virginia first. Thus, he marched north to link up with an expeditionary force that Clinton had dispatched to Virginia under General Benedict Arnold to augment his army's depleted strength and resources. Cornwallis, however, failed to relay these plans to Clinton in both a timely and coherent manner, which led to Clinton feeling that Cornwallis was deliberately disobeying his orders, or again, lack thereof, and that this continuance of Cornwallis's efforts were intended to undermine his command. Again, adamant on his northern strategy, Clinton was strongly convinced that the American and French armies by this time were scheming to recapture New York, although he never fully ruled out the possibility of an attack on his forces in the South. Basing his predictions off various forms of seemingly accurate intelligence, Clinton started to bolster his defense of New York. To assist with his efforts, Clinton ordered Cornwallis to establish a base of operations somewhere on the coast of the Chesapeake to not only replenish his forces, but to also detach a portion of his force so that it could be shipped back to New York for Clinton's defense of the city. Clinton's orders were unclear to his subordinate, however. Cornwallis was ordered to establish a base, but wasn't really informed of an exact location from Clinton. Cornwallis wandered and bounced between Portsmouth, Virginia, and Yorktown, Virginia, before the latter was decided upon. He entered Virginia in May 1781, but didn't establish a concrete base of operations at Yorktown until August. Owing to this delay in the cloudy correspondence and miscommunications between him and Clinton, Cornwallis was blindsided when he learned that a French fleet loaded with fresh French troops from the Caribbean under the Comte de Grasse was also in the area and already preparing to disembark to link up with forces under the command of the Marquis de Lafayette. Cornwallis and Clinton were caught with their pants down. Cornwallis wrote to Clinton before he learned of the French fleet to inform him that he required at least 6 weeks to fortify the coastal town. The day after the French fleet was spotted by Cornwallis, Clinton also learned that the forces under Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau were moving south to link up with de Grasse's fleet and studying an attempted capture of New York. Clinton rushed a letter to Cornwallis assuring him that a British fleet was on its way and that he was in the process of loading 4,000 men onto transport ships in New York. To Cornwallis, who received Clinton's message on September 16th, help was apparently on the way. Clinton's next letter didn't reach Cornwallis until the end of September, but it informed Cornwallis that Clinton's relief force would finally sail on October 5th. By October 15th, there was no relief in sight, and Cornwallis was forced to inform Clinton that he was in ruined works, a bad position, and with weakened numbers. He surrendered 4 days later. The following day, October 20th, Cornwallis wrote a letter to Clinton and blamed him for the unfortunate outcome. Although he later admitted to writing the letter in the heat of the moment, Cornwallis informed Clinton that he never truly felt that Yorktown was a suitable location to mount a defense, and had Clinton not offered his assurances of a relief force, he would have made some sort of an attempt to escape. When the politically and socially well-connected Cornwallis departed for England on parole, Clinton's paranoia once again exploded. Clinton feared that Cornwallis would arrive in England, be confronted about the surrender in Yorktown, and respond as he did in his October 20th letter by casting all the blame on him. Clinton's problems were self-inflicted, though, as he made the fatal error of including Cornwallis's disparaging letter of October 20th in his official report to Germain. This letter would haunt Clinton for the rest of his life, for it quickly was printed in the British newspapers. Clinton's paranoia soon became a reality, as this is how the British public came to understand the events at Yorktown and throughout the Southern campaign. To them, Clinton was the man who lost America. What followed was an onslaught of accusations and defenses between Cornwallis and Clinton, who each tried to justify their cases and views on how the events during the latter years of the war transpired, particularly Yorktown. Much to Clinton's agony, he continued to shoulder the blame. For the remainder of his life, Clinton launched a crusade in an attempt to absolve himself. Throughout the 1780s and into the 1790s, this crusade became an obsession, which many historians have deemed on the verge of insanity for Clinton. To add insult to injury, the British public throughout that time had become progressively disinterested in the American Revolution, as they simply just wanted to move on and attempt to forget it. For Clinton, a man who couldn't take criticism and needed to publicly justify himself for any blame that he was issued, the public disinterest exponentially escalated his anxiety and frustrations. This resulted in the magnum opus of Clinton's defense, a 3-volume personal account of the war that Clinton called A Historical Detail of 7 Years' Campaigns in North America. Unfortunately, his attempted defense wasn't formally published until the 20th century, so his contemporaries were never really able to read it. Furthermore, to dump more salt in his wounds, all the men Clinton had served with, and who also failed in some capacity during the war, were advancing tremendously in their careers, something that one British officer described Clinton as being quite frantic over. This especially was the case with Cornwallis, who was given a hero's welcome upon his return to England, and in 1786 was made both the royal governor and overall military commander in India, and a knight companion of the most noble order of the Garter. Clinton jealously wrote that Cornwallis was being overloaded with appointments. Similarly, General Howe, who went under an inquiry for his disastrous results of his 1777 campaign, was promoted to Lieutenant General of the Ordnance and appointed to the Privy Council in 1782. In the 1790s, he was promoted as a full general and accepted a royal governorship. Finally, Burgoyne was given command as colonel of the King's Own Regiment, appointed commander-in-chief of the British forces in Ireland, and appointed a privy councillor. Clinton received no such recognition or appointments like those of his so-called rivals until 1794, when he was appointed governor of Gibraltar, a post that he never served in, as he died in 1795. For Clinton, all he wanted was a formal inquiry to use as a stage to elevate and justify himself. Instead, the only stages he had at his disposal came in the form of publications like Charles Stedman's History of the Origins, Progress, and Termination of the American War. As I previously noted, there are 80 pages in Volume 1 of Stedman's history, where Clinton adds his opinions that consist of critiques and defenses, but more so arrogant comments of jabs on events that take place in the early stages of the war, the first event being Bunker Hill, where he wrote that he had given his humble opinion to Generals Gage and Howe that if we were forced from Boston, it would be whenever the enemy possessed Foster Hill, which is another piece of high ground alongside Dorchester Heights. This was Clinton saying, "I told you so," regarding his suggestion that the British Army should have occupied the high ground. The next major event that Clinton refuted surrounded Stedman's interpretation of the Siege of Charleston in 1777, which was once again a humiliating defeat for Clinton. Here he attempts to refute Stedman's implication that there was the existence of a floating or fixed batteries used to cover the landing that Clinton embarked on. Here, Clinton justified himself by writing that there weren't any at all, again, trying to place the blame on the Royal Navy for this. He also refutes Stedman's critique of the initially planned landing on Sullivan's Island, which Clinton wrote that was a plan that had long been given up. Additionally, Clinton, like Stedman, is quite critical of General Howe. Referring to the landing of Kipps Bay in New York and the disagreements that he and Howe had regarding the location of where to land the troops, Clinton wrote that nothing but Lord Howe's obstinacy could have exposed us to such perils. In describing Howe's decision to launch a destructive raid on Danbury, Connecticut to destroy Continental munitions on April 26, 1777, that resulted in numerous British casualties, Clinton refers to General Benedict Arnold's surprise counterattack on the British forces as a second Lexington. Like other British officers, Clinton felt strongly that the events of Lexington and Concord in 1775 were unwarranted and easily avoidable disasters. Furthermore, Clinton's one-upper mentality shined through his comments pertaining to different aspects of the Philadelphia campaign. Although Howe was surprised at the Battle of Germantown, he still secured a victory. Clinton, however, made it a point to downplay Howe's victory by writing, "Had Washington left a corps to observe this house," he's talking about the Benjamin Chew House, "and proceeded, there is no saying what might have been the consequence." Again, the Benjamin Chew House is where the British held themselves up in and just barely skated by with the victory. He took another stab at Howe's overall command through his refuting of the devastating attack that was put on by the Hessians at Fort Mercer. Clinton wrote that had this attack been made at night or at low water when the rebel galleys could not have acted, it might have succeeded. Again, here we go with Clinton just trying to elevate his mindset there, his knowledge. The most substantial and lengthiest annotations pertain to the northern theater of the 1777 campaign surrounding General John Burgoyne, someone who Clinton was extremely jealous of, as again, he wanted Burgoyne's command. Pertaining to Stedman's accounts of Burgoyne's overall plan for his expedition to Albany, Clinton wrote that if Burgoyne really meant to establish himself at Albany and was sure that he could be subsisted there, perhaps he had better have made this his principal attack. It failed from inadequate numbers and cannon of caliber. Clinton, referring to himself in the third person, also attempted to prove that he was Burgoyne's savior when he wrote that, again in the third person, Sir Henry Clinton, thinking General Burgoyne might want some assistance, offered in a letter of September 12th to make an attempt to the forts as soon as the expected reinforcement from Europe should arrive. General Burgoyne fought at the Battle of Saratoga on the 19th, and on the 21st tells in answer that even the slightest attempt would be of use. Sir Henry Clinton received this on September 29th and moved the 2nd of October. On the 27th of September, General Burgoyne had received information that his galleys, gunboats set on Lake George had been surprised and destroyed by General Lincoln, that he had consequently lost his communications with Canada. "'Tis pity. he had instantly fallen back to recover them, and for the first time calls Sir Henry Clinton for cooperation and requires 1,000 more men from New York to penetrate to Albany to keep open communications with New York and supply his army at Albany. And if he does not hear from Sir Henry Clinton that he can do so, he will retire to Ticonderoga on the 12th. On the next page, he then takes aim at Sir Guy Carleton, another British general, when Stedman writes of Burgoyne's misfortunes. Clinton wrote that 'tis pity Guy Carleton could not have shared a few troops to reinforce. Guy Carleton was obviously bogged down on the western side in the Mohawk Valley. Furthermore, when Stedman commented on Burgoyne's decision to delay their march, so the army could obstruct the roads and disable bridges along the route and the retreat during the retreat to Saratoga, Clinton takes another jab. 'Tis pity that he had not instantly passed the Hudson and retired to Fort Edward. The rebels had 2 rivers and ravines to turn before they could get there. Basically saying that if Burgoyne hadn't done that, he would have made it out. It was just poor decision-making on Burgoyne. Finally, when Stedman described Burgoyne's critical position while he was on the brink of disaster, Clinton audaciously wrote, on the very same day of this action, Sir Henry Clinton had the extraordinarily good fortune to take by assault all the forts in the Highlands. So everything's falling apart for Burgoyne, but Clinton still wants to get that, I was there, I was doing exactly what I was supposed to. Clinton's annotations show that he was making an attempt to rewrite Stedman's history. They also show how obsessed Clinton was in attempting to elevate his role again and prove his importance throughout the various stages of the war, even if it was almost 20 years later. Could you imagine if this guy had a Facebook or a Twitter account? I mean, he would be like all over the place, just probably banned instantly. Volume 1 of Stedman's history concludes around the time Clinton was appointed as commander-in-chief. So you may be asking yourself, if Clinton was so defensive and critical and arrogant throughout Volume 1, why didn't he make any remarks in the margins of Volume 2? Well, Clinton didn't let us down there either. As if these annotations weren't enough to prove Clinton's obsession with clearing his name, shortly after Stedman published his history, Clinton launched his final defense by publishing a more formal 34-page manuscript entitled Observations on Mr. Stedman's History of the American War. His thoughts on Volume 2 are all included in this manuscript and make up pages 5 through 34. There are only 2 series of events that are really discussed in Clinton's observations. Stedman's assessment of the first failed siege of Charleston, and again, that humiliating defeat for Clinton, along with all of the events that transpired during Clinton's time as commander-in-chief. Before launching his defense against Stedman, Clinton wrote that he found himself obliged to notice some insinuations and contradict some assertions in Mr. Stedman's History of the American War lately published, as there were parts which proved that Mr. Stedman wanted either attention or candor. The largest portion of this published defense relates to Yorktown, as Stedman bases his interpretation on Yorktown on the bane of Clinton's existence at that time, Cornwallis's letter from October 20th, 1781. Again, that directly blamed Clinton. As Stedman served with his forces, he was seemingly sympathetic towards Cornwallis as he continuously praised his lordship throughout his interpretations of the Southern campaign in Yorktown. Also important to note is the fact that it was through, again, the influence of Cornwallis that Stedman was appointed to the position of Deputy Controller and Accountant General of the Revenue of Stamps in 1797, 3 years after his history's publication, which begs the question as to whether or not this was a coincidence. One will never know. Regardless, Stedman's favor towards Cornwallis was also more than likely an added factor in Clinton's obligation to contradict the assertions made throughout Stedman's history. Although I'm unable to read Clinton's entire rebuttal, I will read Clinton's concluding statement on the last page. It reads, "Thus, from the instant Sir Henry Clinton was ordered to take the command of the army to the moment he obtained His Majesty's permission to resign it, he flatters himself he produces indisputable proofs of His Majesty's fullest approbation of his conduct." And you can just see Clinton writing this at 3 a.m. over candlelight, just wearing down the nib of his quill in anger. Both Clinton's annotations in his history of Stedman's history and his formal published rebuttal have been considered claims based on personal fabrications. In 1958, interestingly enough, historian William B. Wilcox conducted a psychoanalytical study of Clinton's personality, for which he consulted with an, at the time, professor of psychology and head of the psychological clinic at the University of Michigan, Dr. Frederick Wyatt. Published in in the William and Mary Quarterly, and based on Wyatt's professional opinion, Wilcox's study concluded that the essence of Clinton's personality was an unconscious conflict over authority. Basically, he desired it, but was afraid to exercise it. Wilcox and Wyatt asserted that the conflict affected his conduct throughout the war. According to the two scholars, before Clinton was made commander-in-chief, he was, quote unquote, intent on telling his superiors what to do. He obviously craved power, he often implied, and occasionally said that he ought to have it because he knew better than anybody else who had it. After he was made commander-in-chief and finally had overall authority, he was, quote unquote, hesitant and unhappy about using his power, and that his attitude suggests an unconscious conviction that he ought not to have it at all. Professor Wyatt speculated that this started from a young age for Clinton, and that was the culprit that lingered on throughout the rest of his life. So General Sir Henry Clinton was a man who was given and was issued a task that he knew was prone to fail. The expectations placed upon him by his superiors were exceedingly high, given the means he had to carry out his orders. At the end of the day, Clinton found himself the victim of a broken British system, but he doesn't deserve to be completely absolved, as his conduct wasn't at all exemplary, as shown through the opinions of other officers he served with and the various writings throughout his life, including all of the annotations and his rebuttal to Stedman's The History of the Origin, Progress, and Termination of the American War. Through all of these, we can clearly see Clinton's true colors that offer an understanding as to why he was criticized so much. This copy of Stedman's history is not only a unique secondary treasure in that it offers a detailed interpretation of the war from the British perspective, but it also serves as an insightful tool that contains vital primary source material to help us better understand the impact of war on a man who played such a critical role in its outcome and legacy. So with that, I will take questions and answer them to the best of my ability if there are any. Okay. Go ahead. Can you repeat that one more time, please? Not necessarily. Clinton was very, I'm sorry, I didn't repeat the question. Bad, Andrew. The question was, did General Howe was he had kind sentiments towards the Americans. He wanted to negotiate some kind of peace. Do you think that Clinton was critical of him for this and any reason? Not necessarily. Nothing that I could find showed this at all. Clinton had a soft spot for American loyalists but as well. But he never. No, I didn't find anything in my research. I'm not going too deep down the rabbit hole. Yes. Sure. So this was another rabbit hole I didn't want to go down because it was a 24-page report that came. The question, sorry, keep forgetting to do this. The question was my reference to the psychoanalytical study and how his family and upbringing affected Clinton's personality later on in the war and how they came to this assessment. It really stemmed from, according to the report, the short answer is it was between his father and him. That's what they were blaming as the issue that this all stemmed from. Clinton had an upbringing that was, I don't want to say delicate, but privileged, and he always turned to his father for decisions and being told what to do, essentially. But secretly, he always had that mentality that he was better than others, but when push came to shove, he never fully wanted to commit to something and give his decision in the matter. And again, that all, according to the report, stemmed from the relationship between his father and Clinton himself. His father, again, was very well connected. Sure. Well, again, the question was Bunker Hill. Stedman obviously wasn't there, and where was the main source? How accurate were the sources that he was using to make such, such an interpretation of it? Essentially, again, that all stems from the annual register. So the annual register was a compilation of various reports. It was it also included personal accounts. So it was a hodgepodge of primary and secondary sources that Stedman had to use at his disposal. So again, that was the main influence for volume 1. So that's where he was getting it from. And the annual registers, again, it's just like reading a letter from any British or a report from any British American officer. It could be like any other source in modern history. It could be biased, but those are the sources that Stedman had at his disposal. So you really have to go to the root of that. But to Stedman, they were accurate because these were coming from the front lines. They were coming from participants that were at the Battle of Bunker Hill. So, yeah. Say that one more time, please. There were no, because this would have been in volume 2, and there were no. The question was there any? What was Stedman's interpretation on the siege of Savannah, and were there any annotations that General Howe wrote on that, or General Clinton, excuse me? I didn't read that part of Stedman's. Again, this is 800 pages, and since there were no annotations in volume 2, I didn't read that part, so I can't answer that question one way or another. So I apologize. But if you want to come check it out, come visit us at Anderson House. Sure. Oh, God, I'm looking at Paul Newman here, my British colleague, staring at me in the back of the room. I don't, the question was, where does General Clinton rank in terms of British generals in the war? Well, obviously I don't think too highly of the man after this, this scrutiny, but they all have their own flaws. I mean, General Howe, Burgoyne, Gay. I mean, they all have their own personal flaws. I don't know. I don't know how I would rank that. It's too much pressure. I wouldn't put him high, that's for sure. I would put him at the lower end of the list. Fair enough, Paul? Good, thank you. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you for those attending on Zoom. Thank you for attending in person. For those of you in person, we do have both volumes on the table in front of me. We also have Clinton's observations, his rebuttal to Stedman's work, and the receipt that he obtained when he purchased his own copy. So again, thank you all for coming out, and thank you all for tuning in. Have a great weekend. See you next time.